with us. And we're going to talk about a lot of things from crossroads to pre-crossroads to post-crossroads to professional work. Um, but I want to start with, Darryl, as I was thinking about us getting together now, and this is judgmental, but in some ways I thought, oh, Daryl's like the model crossroads student. This is, you know, who the school would always want and who takes advantage of the opportunities. But I want to get your take on that because like if I'm way off, and you thought it was just a terrible place or whatever, we should get that out on the record right now.
Sure. Arthur, that's very kind of you. It didn't, I mean, yeah, where to start? In my recollection, the story goes a little bit differently, and not to be contrarian, but as I recall, the school was most excited about my older sister, Erin, for those of you who know her, and that's if I remember. And Erin is very charismatic and very dynamic, and we heard a similar kind of story from, I've been watching all of your interviews, and we heard a similar kind of story from Stephanie Smith. But in my memory, the school was very excited about Erin coming. And in my memory, I was very immature and irresponsible and not the model. One might perhaps grow into becoming a model, but I don't think one is necessarily, especially in in one's middle school slash early high school years. It's you're not. I don't think it's hard to be a model when you're at that phase in your life. So that's very kind of you to say. And yeah, I mean, I feel like I grew an extraordinary amount of crosswords. And yes, I did take advantage. I tried to take advantage of as much as possible. So that's absolutely true. But in terms of being a model, I'll say yes to taking advantage, and I'll say question mark on being a model student.
Well,
So
let me first say that I think you're absolutely right. We were thrilled to have Aaron come join the ranks and Tara later. But,
yes, yeah.
um, you know, you brought a special sense of inquisitiveness and energy. And I may have mentioned this to you before, but when I think of you and I think of Sean Domzalski and Josh Cohn and others, in the computer room, writing, playing games, and just really feasting on kind of one another's presence there. So,
Yeah,
um,
I'm glad you're highlighting that because again, it was that sort of synergy between the teachers and the students. I mean, we had a kind of community. And sure, my close friends, Sean, Josh, Paul Steffen, and others, especially in those early years. I mean, we were very thick, and even before the computer room, so even on Lindell. But at the
mhm.
same time, I have these memories of being pushed by the teachers, right? So Kim, who many people have mentioned, later Louise Cameron, and of course Carol, Carmel, always being pushed to do what the most that you can, and also V. Lind. I mean, she was extraordinary, an extraordinary teacher of English, and so the kind of the encouragement slash demands placed on us say, you can do, and that's a message I often received. That's why I'm going back to, I don't know if I was the model, because I was often being told in those early years, you can do more, you can do better. And that was a good message for me. I don't know if everyone responds to that message, but I responded to that message. And so there was a kind of rigor to the Crossroads experience and but at the same time, all the wacky things that many other people are highlighting. Um, but yeah, there was that combination of rigorousness and sort of, I mean, I don't think anyone's used the word wacky, but I will. And the kind of wackiness of, sleeping out on everyone talks about sleeping on the top of a parking garage or
Yeah.
whatever. Or for me, the parking garage, and maybe I never even went on that trip, but Cahokia Mounds for sure, and the experience of camping. And I had camped before, but the sort of, and this comes back to the sort of cohort or group thing, that we were figuring out how to be peers together, and to respect each other. And at the celebration, a couple weekends ago, it was such a pleasure to see both Stephanie Smith and Catherine Parker. I want to give a shout out to here, just as we reflect on these times. They were such extraordinary figures, sort of leaders in the student community, and saying, hey, that's not acceptable. Sometimes, sort of pulling people aside and saying, hey, you should be kinder, you should be more considerate, you should, sort of laying down the law at times. and sort of setting a standard for peer interaction. So there was that
I'm
as
so
well.
glad you said that, Darryl, because yeah, I think both of them in so many quiet ways
Yeah.
would try to bring people back from doing things that weren't particularly productive for them nor for the school. So
Yep. Yeah.
I find it most intriguing. The five teachers you mentioned are all women,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that may tell you something about Crossroads as well. I think absolutely the teachers who were um, most, I don't know if demanding, but let's just say commanding almost.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Commanding and rigorous, right?
yeah.
So, I mean, so I took AP art history with Louise, and I mean, so it's this combination of in Louise's classes, we could in artwork, it was you could do whatever you wanted. I mean, it was very open-ended. I mean, she would give
Hmm.
assignment. I don't know if you remember this, but I made an enormous sculpture that was in the lobby for a while. This sort of I mean, it was this figure of a man, and she was, yeah, go forth, create. And so that was Louise on the one hand, and then at the same time, though, she was like, we did this AP course, I've since being at Crossroads, I've had opportunities to travel and go to art museums in different places around the world. And thanks to Louise, I can appreciate things and see things in ways that I would not have seen otherwise. So, I mean, as a kid, I never liked Impressionism, the pinks and the purples or whatever. And then, traveling in the south of France and it's twilight, and all of a sudden everything's pink and purple, and you're like, wow, they really got something there. So you can, that sort of, but the deeper. Understanding of what people were trying to do in art history and the transformations that thinkers and painters and folks wrought through that process. And Louise bringing that forward. That's just one example of the rigor. So
So when you were at Crossroads, did you have any sense that you might be moving towards study of Japan and in a particular century for a focus and a particular part of the whole political, public, private
yeah,
realm? Um,
yeah. I mean, so the Japan thing came in as a result of going abroad for AFS. And again, this is another thing, and this comes back to family support. And I mean, I'm sort of giving shout outs here, and I want to give a shout out to my parents as well.
Great.
And that's, um, I mean, I know Crossroads could be as a community, could be so supportive across the board. And it was helpful for me to have a message from my parents of, we didn't have a lot of money, as you know, but the idea was finances should never be a limiter. Like if you should just set your sights as high as possible and then work to achieve. And so the opportunity to go abroad with AFS was a big turning point for me. So that summer, there was a possibility to go to China, and then I think Japan was on the menu, and then Turkey. And of course, other places as well. But I wanted to go to the most exotic, distant. I had never been abroad meaningfully in my life. I think we went one summer to the Bahamas, but I think that might have been after Japan. But we'd never really been, aside from that, never been abroad. For any length of time. And so I thought, wow, if I could go to one of those places, that would be amazing. And they canceled the China trip that summer, or I might have become a historian of China, who knows? But I went to Kyoto, which was an extraordinary experience. And that's what launched me on the Japan inquiry. If I could go a little bit further, Arthur, I would
Yeah,
say,
yeah.
I mean, so going to Kyoto go back to the summer of '83, and we're thinking about St. Louis in the '80s, and we're thinking about a time when people were very concerned about personal crime, particularly in St. Louis, and it was sort of our part of our everyday life. And there were neighborhoods where, you could redline St. Louis and say, you probably shouldn't walk here, definitely not at night, if, for someone coming outside of the community. Including for me, as you know, I bicycled from North County to Crossroads, and I would make a huge loop. And it wasn't just because it was better roads; it was because when I went through certain neighborhoods, people would throw bottles and rocks at me and that kind of thing. So I was like, okay, I'll avoid that. And so when I got to Japan, I said to my host family, "Well, can you tell me?" Because I was bringing that mentality baked in, and I said to my host family in Kyoto, Japan, "Can you tell me the dangerous neighborhoods?" And they didn't speak very much English, and I didn't speak very much Japanese. And they were like, that we could translate the word dangerous into Japanese easy enough, but they were like, what do you mean? Like, you mean traffic accidents? Because they were saying, here, we're going to loan
Yeah.
you this bicycle and you can, just like you do back at home. You said you like to cycle, bicycle anywhere, go explore, It's like, well, where should I not go? And they just didn't understand, like, oh, there was, yeah, lots of, they were focused on traffic accidents. And I was kind of like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. It was inconceivable for them. And that sort of sparked me to think, we talk a lot about freedom in the United States, but like that kind of freedom from everyday life fear, it was, it was extraordinarily liberating for me to be in Japan and not never be concerned about my personal well-being in any setting at any time of day or night. So that I didn't quite grasp how important that was till later, sort of thinking back on it, reflecting on it later. But that was a big turning point for me to say, wow, this is a place where one can go, and trying to understand how that works. And that's kind of a big departure point for my work, my scholarly work.
And to what do you attribute um, the low level, certainly of violent crime in
Yeah.
Japan, and it being, and it has gone down in the U.S., but still being on
Yes.
a relative basis so high?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole host of factors. There's a kind of, so just on, I mean, it's too many to list. Um, I mean, there's gun policy. I think I lost a job actually at a university where I went, and I said to one of the administrators who was interviewing me, I said, that they do things right regarding gun regulation in Japan, and we got in a heated dispute about gun policy in Japan versus the United States because they don't have the gun violence that we have here. So that's
Yeah.
one. I mean. Um, and again, yes, I know the crime rates are going down in the United States, but just flashing back to the early 80s and the sense of personal crime and violence in St. Louis that was endemic at that time, and people putting the club, I don't know if you remember the club on the wheel of their car, and
Yes, yes.
concern about theft and that kind of thing. So there's none of that in Japan. It has to do with policing. It has to do with a different kind of balance of individual versus collective needs. And so there's a willingness, I think, to allow the state to step a little bit more on the side of individual rights than is acceptable or tolerated here in the United States. To give a really concrete example of that, when I moved to Japan to do dissertation research, there was a knock on my door. And in Japan, there's a thing called the genkan, which is there's a sliding door to the outside, and then there's a little space that's below the floor level. And that's it's a very jargony word, but liminal space. It's like in between public and private. So they opened the door, and the two policemen opened the sliding door and stepped into that space. Like I had said, hello, yes. And they had said, excuse us. And they stepped. So they were in the United States, that would be like, no, I did not say you could come into my house. But in Japan, it's like sort of it's hadn't locked the door, and I said hello, and they said excuse us for coming in, and they were very polite. And they said, oh, welcome to the neighborhood, and we because you have to register at the local office, and so I had registered because as a resident alien. Like, oh, welcome to the neighborhood. How many people are living here? What are you doing? And so they sort of had a little mini interview, and I don't think we would tolerate that in the United States, but in Japan, that's just sort of like that was fine. So it was very interesting for me just to have that personal experience. But that's so policing, guns, and then also on the individual level, each person saying, I'm not going to just try to grab for myself. And that comes to a greater sense of, for example, the policy around labor and income inequality. The sense is that there should be full employment in Japanese society, and that the aim is to have sort of everyone rising together. Of course, there's income inequality and that kind of thing, but it's nothing on the level of the United States. And so, again, a personal anecdote, like I once dropped my wallet at the top of the steps down to the subway. I was rushing to get my train and grabbing things and putting them in my pocket. And I got down to the machine to buy a ticket, and I didn't have my wallet. And I knew I left the home with it, so I ran back up the stairs, retracing my steps, and I could see it on the top of the steps at one of the most crowded train stations in Kyoto. There's my wallet sitting right there. And no one,
Wow.
like hundreds, thousands of people had walked in. It was like rush hour in the morning. no one had stolen it. It was just sitting, full of cash because that's just how Japan works. And there's a kind of public sense of we would rather have everyone's saying it's a, if you can think about it as a social contract, like we would rather live in that world um, than another world. So
So when you after you'd gone to Japan and as time went on and you wanted to pursue your interest in Japan in the academic world, what brought you to the 19th century?
yeah. Um, I, is, so I began more in the early 20th century. So that's where I began. But historians, like we always, we might have an orientation, an interest. We begin to question, and then as you begin to look at materials, the materials take you sometimes someplace else. And so that's how I ended up moving backward in time. I was actually doing a project on what I was thinking of as civil society in the early 20th century and looking at organizations, interest groups, basically. And then to make it manageable, I focused on associations of lawyers. And then as I thought about lawyers in Japanese society, I thought, wow, there's really not much good scholarship on law and legal practice in this earlier period. And everyone's like, well, there was no law and legal practice. That's why. And I was like, that doesn't really, that I don't think so. Like people had disputes. How did they resolve them? And so I began to look at the 19th century, the Tokugawa period, which runs from roughly 1600 to 1868. And that's a time when, in Japanese society, you had samurai with their hair shaved all the way back to here and the top knot and the two swords. And so to say, like, what role did law have in that world? A lot of folks are like, the answer is none. Samurai were at the top, and that was it. But that's not correct, as my book argues, and that's increasingly the consensus within Japanese legal historians, circles of Japanese legal historians. But when I was doing the research, the general sense was no, there was this abrupt break in 1868, and everything before was just might makes right, and after that, we begin to get a legal society, and so that's I think the big question or big thing for me to think about in my work.
Got it. So if we go back, you were at Crossroads in the 1980s, as you
Yeah,
said. Like there were a lot of people at that time who said, Japan's economy is the model for the world.
yeah,
Other countries have to learn to emulate Japan,
yeah,
and that there never will be a period of time in the foreseeable future when Japan won't have the most vibrant economy in the world.
yep.
Um, that's not the way people are talking now. How did that come to be?
Yeah, that was another huge thing for me when I went there, actually, was because, yes, so Ezra Vogel, there's a book that came out in 1979, 1980 by a sociologist at Harvard named Ezra Vogel. And the title of the book was Japan as Number One. And so the argument was that Japan, yes, as you suggested, would surpass the United States and become the number one economy in the world. And if we didn't want to, the United States didn't want to lose out, then we should emulate Japan and do all things Japanese. And there were all these discussions about, oh, Japan works this way and Japan works that way. And I think there's much to celebrate in Japanese culture, as I've already suggested. But I don't think that the economic model, as we now, most people would agree, that the economic model is not transferable as people imagined and wasn't as wonderful as it was, suggested to be. And the big thing for me when I was just even as a high school student there, I didn't see the Japan that I was reading about here. And that was another thing that I was thinking, like, wow, I should really get into this and come back and tell people, no, it's like, these Japanese people are normal people, people just like us. They're not because there was a lot of the argument at that time was about, and sure, I mean, I suggested, okay, people won't steal your wallet from the top of the steps, but that's true enough. But at the same time, I mean, kids, and I was in class, I went to a high school as part of the AFS experience. And, kids were the same, very similar there to how we are here, listening to music. And I was into punk rock music at the time. There was a punk rock scene. Kids would go to bowling alleys on Saturday afternoons. They would take off their school uniforms. Because you had school on Saturday mornings in Japan, and they would take it off, put it in the locker, and then change, transform into punk rockers, go into the punk rock show in the afternoon, and then come back, transform back into, and then put on their school uniform and go home.
Now that,
And
that
so
that's different from here. I mean,
it is
because
different. That is
one of the
extraordinarily
most
different in terms of the not being able to sort of represent your full self, but at the same time trying to and exploring that. And for them, it was like that was like really stepping out of line. And so there were also, and that wasn't imaginable for these folks who were saying, oh, the Japanese people are such hard work, they work all the time and so yeah. So I didn't see in Japan the same Japan that folks who are talking about, oh, we should restructure the American economy to be modeled after the Japanese
Interesting.
economy.
So just tell us a little bit about how you and the University of Delaware became a match, and then we can go back to Crossroads days.
Yeah. Um, So that's leaving. So Arthur, I want to go back. Actually, if you don't mind, I would want to go back because I want to sort of give a message if anyone's watching this who's like a Crossroads student or a student who's thinking about like a career path. I'd love to go back to the transition from college to working world.
Okay.
And then I'm happy to get to my working world moment, if that's okay. So yeah, so you asked about me ending up at the University of Delaware, and to get there, we have to get from sort of being an undergraduate history major, which I was. So I was a history major at Johns Hopkins. They didn't have a Japanese program. They said that they were going to develop one when I applied, and they didn't get it developed while I was there. So I ended up being a Chinese history major but every time I could do my own project, I did a project on Japan. And so that's how I spent my undergraduate years. So I was a history major, and I was also interested in politics. And when I went to graduate, I said, "Oh, I want to go to grad school in history." And all of the professors said, "Well, being a history professor was great back in our time." So they were all older, and they were like, "But yeah, we don't think you want to do that now in the current changing environment. Why don't you explore other interests that you have?" So I went and worked in DC for a while. I did a number of different jobs. I worked in politics. I worked for a Japanese newspaper, and that brought me back to Japan. And then from Japan, I applied to grad school. So that's how. So it was a kind of circuitous route from being an undergraduate history major to then going to graduate school in Japanese history. Um, and so yeah, going to the University of Delaware, I mean that's the sort of it was serendipitous. It's been wonderful. It's a great institution. It's a strong history department. I have wonderful colleagues. Um, but you just sort of to go on the academic job market is very challenging because it's a lot about fit between the candidate and the department. And so there'll be a number of qualified candidates that apply for jobs. And I've now seen this from the other, from the other side, hiring people. But as a candidate, you're, lots of qualified folks, and then you go and then they see like, oh, is their research going to, the research project, does it mesh with what we're interested here? Does their personality mesh? A lot of things that are just not, as easily recognizable when you send out the packet with your dissertation and your writing sample and that kind of thing. So that's how, so, you apply to tons of different places. And then if someone says, yeah, we're interested, you have the offer, you're excited, and then you move there. So I moved to Delaware from New York City in 2004, and I've been at Delaware for 20 years now, which is astonishing to me in retrospect. But
Well, that's terrific. Yeah, yeah. You kind of passed over, but you said you spent some time in with various jobs in DC.
yeah,
Yeah, and being involved in politics. Can you tell us anything more about that?
sure. I mean, I volunteered on the Clinton campaign in
Hmm.
its the early phase in New Hampshire. So I went up and I was living in DC at the time. I was working for a lobbying group for the health insurance industry, which was an extraordinary opportunity. I learned an awful lot. I'm not for maintaining the healthcare system as it is now, and it was very funny. I would go to parties and people would say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I learned to say I was working in healthcare policy, and they'd be like, "Yeah, fight the good fight, man." And I'm like, sort of embarrassingly looked down at the ground because I was working for the insurance industry. But that's okay. I learned an enormous amount
That's wonderful. Okay.
about DC. I worked there for about a year. It was the Health
Okay.
Insurance Association of America.
Okay.
The president of that organization, again, I mean, so often, and again, if I don't know who your viewership is, but if it's for you know people, younger folks or students. I mean, it's important just to meet people and explore opportunities. And someone I had graduating from Hopkins, I had a job lined up to work for a law firm as a paralegal. And I'd come to know this guy who was the president of this health insurance lobbying thing. And he was trained as a lawyer, and his wife was a lawyer. And he said to me, "You don't want to be a paralegal at Skadden Arps in New York City, working like 100 hours a week, doing, making photocopies and whatever, and being bossed around by a lawyer." He's like, "If you want to be a lawyer, go to law school." He says, "If you want to learn something and do something interesting, come work for me." And so I did that for a year, and I learned a ton. But one of the things I learned was I don't want to be working for the health insurance industry lobby. But I also learned about how DC works, and in that process, I began to meet people, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll explore working on campaigns. And so I worked for the Clinton campaign for a while. But I also figured out, I mean, just another sort of message I would suggest is just try things and do things. I worked, as a volunteer on the campaign, and it wasn't for me. Um, it's a rough and tumble kind of work, and I'm not cut out for that. I learned so.
I'm
And then I
I'm
worked, I did temp jobs too. I worked at the Peace Corps in DC and other
hmm,
things. And then I finally landed a steady job helping a Japanese newspaper cover the presidential election, which was got me back into doing Japanese, being in connection with Japan and Japanese concerns. And again, I just met these extraordinary people, and they became supportive of me in learning more about Japan later. So.
what you said about the politics not being cut out for you, and it reminds me. I guess this would have been around 2008 or something here, and we were going to work for a woman who's running for re-election in the Missouri State Senate, and this was the opening meeting of her campaign. The first thing she said, and she's very progressive and you know, very kind person to be around. First thing she said, okay, we got to get our op research going,
Mhm.
our opposition research.
Yeah,
I was done. That,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
And,
so this
and,
was
and
the Democratic primary. I was volunteering for the Democratic primary for Clinton in New Hampshire, and the campaigns were breaking into each other's cars to steal voter rolls. So smashing windows and
yeah,
stealing. So you would do, this is door knocking, and people
right,
were bragging about taking the literature from other campaigns. This is not inter-party. This is intra-party. So,
right.
people stealing the campaign literature from other campaigns and bragging about it. And it was a kind of a feature of, and it was encouraged, by the folks who were, you know, managing us. And so, yeah, I was just kind of like, I can't. That was just,
Yeah.
that was just one example. I mean, I wasn't naive about it, but at the same time, it's just, it wasn't for me. So,
Well, I'm just wondering, and we are going to have to wrap it up because people keep saying don't make the whole thing much more than a half an hour, and we've
okay,
gone for a
sure.
long time. But I do want to ask you, so I mean, culturally in Japan, just what you were talking about, breaking into one another's cars,
Yeah.
political gain, is that something that um, you wouldn't happen there, or
Unimaginable.
pardon?
Unimaginable. It's unimaginable.
Oh,
Yeah.
because
Well, and
what?
that's the
There's
kind of
certain
thing about in the United States also. So I just recently went to, again, coming back to this sort of sense of crime and safety. And just over the summer, it's not Japan related, but I was on leisure. I had a chance to go to Ireland over the summer. And we were walking down the street and I saw someone's purse sitting on the passenger side next to the window. I sort of had a visceral reaction like, you shouldn't have, the car was locked or whatever, and it was just sitting on this thoroughfare. And I was like thinking like, oh, and then I realized, no, probably not. Like, I guess in this major city in Ireland, this is in Galway, I don't think we need to worry about that. But and so that's that kind of, I mean, I think in the United States, one of the key things that we might think about is having more of a discussion of, is that the society that we want to live in? And how do we get away from the society
we
where
you've traveled a lot. I mean, do you think that there are huge segments of the American population who feel like if you try to adapt anything from another country, from another culture, that you're somehow being un-American? Or
there is that for sure. Yeah, there's absolutely that. Yeah.
yeah, hmm.
I mean, there's argument that's always the argument that comes up about gun policy.
Right.
So for example, for Japan, and that's why people are looking, I guess, is it Finland? I'm not an expert on gun policy, but like where, the gun ownership is akin to the United States, but still there aren't as many, there isn't the
I
same kind
believe
of
that's Finland.
violence. And so,
But
yes, people
Japan,
point to Finland and, because they say, well, we can't be like the Japanese, but maybe we could be like the Finnish. So,
well, one last question about Japan, and that is, I mean, isn't there a history of violence, at least in fiction and,
mhm.
horror movies and,
Yeah.
um, you know, I
I
mean,
had
is
a
that
very similar
another one?
conversation about this with a student just the other day because they were saying, they were asking me this kind of question. And I was saying, when people think and talk about violence in the United States, they often say, oh, there are lots of violent movies, violent video games. And so I think and there's plenty of that in Japan too. So, I mean, they play the same, their young males play the same video games that our the young males that are then,
Okay.
that then commit, acts of violence here in the United States. So it has more to do, and again, I don't think Japan's perfect, and there's alienation in Japanese society. There's a phenomenon there called hikikomori, where people feel so pressured by conformism that they don't want to leave their homes. So there's that's the kind of flip side. So that there needs to, we would have to take another 2 hours or something, but it's yeah, so it's there's an interconnected sort of web of different factors, I would suggest, but I think it's important to have a discussion, like what kind of society or community do we want to live in, and that's not a discussion that people have a lot, I would say, in our polarized environment. This, sort of a lot of clickbait and reviling the
Right.
other, which yeah, I had a very spirited discussion just over the weekend with a friend about um, reviling someone who doesn't agree with you in politics. That seems to be the norm, but I don't think that's productive. So,
Okay, I'm going to do one more. Okay.
okay.
All right. And that is, um, I've talked with people teaching preschool, elementary school, middle school, high school. I haven't talked with anybody teaching college about how students seem to not have the inquisitiveness, the energy, the curiosity that they had in the past. And with the younger kids, it's often pegged to the pandemic, and that can make sense. I'm just wondering if you find that students at UD are any different now from when you began.
I mean, the huge thing is, as you know, the cell phone, right? So that's the huge thing. And I'll be very candid. It saddens me to go into a classroom, and now I'm hoping that my students are hearing me say this, although I don't quite put it in these plain terms to them in the classroom space. But it saddens me to go into a room and see a room full of people all looking at their phones and not talking to the person next to them. So on an emotional level, it's just saddening. So, um, and so that just means that they're missing out in those kind of in between spaces. And they could say, "Oh, maybe I'm texting with a friend," but usually they're not. Usually they're consuming some because I wander around sometimes, and they're oblivious to my presence wandering around. I'm like looking over their shoulder, like, what are you doing?" Not in a kind of creepy way, but in a kind of just a sort of sampling way, right? A polling
Right.
way, if you will.
Yeah.
And so, like, what are they looking at? And usually it's some sort of media, and they're just it's a sort of filling the time and space, and they could be filling that with chatting with each other. And I think that would make comes back to these concerns about mental health and about stress and about so pessimism versus optimism. I think if they just chatted with their neighbor, they would maybe be a little happier. I had a student come to my office, and she was having a tough time in the class, and I said, well, have you talked to your peers? Do you have a study group? The answer was no. I said, do you have any friends in the class? No. Why don't you chat with, because I see the students and I see them, and I know I often have individual interactions, bilateral interactions with them. And I say, oh, that person that you sit next to, they're a very nice person. Why don't you, I can vouch for them. You can, just turn to them and chat. And so I encourage them to do that. So there is that on the personal level. And then when the question though is about curiosity, and I think that students are at the same, they're curious at the same rate, I would say. So I'm not as perhaps pessimistic in that realm. And I think again, though, and this comes back, we had a brief chat at the celebration where you were asking me about pedagogy. And I try to work in an exercise where students can study something, whatever kind of going back all to like Louise, like do whatever you want. Because I
Yeah.
teach, of course, world history, and everything has a history. And I say you can do the history of anything you want as long as there are three terms. One is that it's world, so that it's not like US history or whatever. So it has to be comparative or a system or some sort of world dimension. Two is it has to have an analytical component. In other words, they're making a claim about it. And and three, it has to have some sort of connection to primary sources. In other words, they're engaged with voices from the past on their own terms. And so and it can be anything. So, I have a student doing uh, concepts of freedom, and she's an African American woman. She's going to do interview family members and then look at African American writers and how they've talked about freedom over time and around the world. Um, I have students doing, history of different kinds of sports and how does that connect with nationalism or, so all kinds of things. So whatever their thing is, they can do it. And I would say that not every student's excited by this project. Many students are like, I just want a question and I just want to answer it. But many students are like, oh, wow, this is, I now have an opportunity to explore something that I'm interested in. Um, and they can, do as they wish. So.
Well, I'm just going to say I have a high bar for enthusiasm and curiosity because I can't help but think about you and Sean, and a number of others. Just when something was going to happen, you guys would be real engaged, but you'd also be talking to one another, and it required as much energy and effort to ask you guys to focus as it did with other people who were less interested. So
Yeah.
when I think of you guys, I can only smile. It's great.
Thank you, Arthur. That's very
Yeah.
kind. Yeah.
So what
And I,
I'll
I want to thank you, Arthur. I mean, Crossroads was extraordinary, and I know so many people had different experiences. And for me personally, Crossroads was just, I mean, it was like the perfect school for me. So, I mean, just if I could have replicated Crossroads, I mean, I have two children, two daughters, and if I could have made a Crossroads for them or found a Crossroads for them, I would have sent them there. Where we live, there is nothing that's quite like Crossroads, and I don't know if there will ever be another school exactly like it, but for me, it was perfect, both in the
um,
rigor and then also in the exploration and experimental nature. So, thank you for that.
so good to hear it. Thank you, dear.